Bloomberg Audio Studios.
Podcasts, radio, news.
You're listening to the Bloomberg Balance of Power podcast. Catch us live weekdays at noon Eastern on Apple CarPlay and Android Auto with the Bloomberg Business app. Listen on demand wherever you get your podcasts or watch us live on YouTube.
Back in Washington, the fastest show in politics, back on Bloomberg TV and radio. I'm glad you joined us here for the Monday edition as we still count votes, certainly in California, with several seats in the House not yet called. So we technically don't know who controls the House of Representatives. It's a pretty deliberate win for Republicans on the Senate side, though we are again waiting for a call in the Arizona Senate race. That'll be the last block. As we learned over the weekend, the Nevada Senate race called and Donald Trump wins the state of Arizona. So we could have some ticket splitting when it comes to Arizona. The House is the Wild West, literally in this case. We've got millions of votes to be counted, nearly 5 million still in California. So it could be days, it could be weeks before we really have a sense of it. If Republicans do keep their majority in the House, it looks like it'll be about as thin as what they have right now. Republicans need 5, Democrats need 15 in the 19 outstanding races. You can do the math. It's looking pretty good for Republicans and the idea of a trifecta, which is where we start our conversation with someone you've been hearing a lot about over the balance of this campaign. Kevin Roberts is president of the Heritage Foundation, and he's out with a new book called Dawn's Early Light, Taking Back Washington to Save America. And he's with us at the table today in Washington. Kevin, it's great to see you. Nice to meet you. Thank you for joining us here.
Joe, thanks for having me. It's a pleasure.
On Bloomberg TV and radio. I've got a lot of questions for you because as one of the forces behind Project 2025, you've been waking up reading about yourself every morning for the last 6 months or so. I don't
That's
know
what
what
I'm told.
That's been like. Yeah, maybe you've been avoiding them. And if that's the case, I salute you. We're in a world where some Republicans have demonized you. Some Democrats have done the same. And quite an experience for the Heritage Foundation here. Now that the election is done, though, Donald Trump is headed back to the White House. And the GOP, as I just mentioned to our viewers and listeners, appears to be on track to controlling both chambers. So do you feel like they won or do you feel like you won?
Oh, they won. And most importantly, the forgotten ordinary American has won, because what really won was an emphasis on common sense solutions to problems. Mm-hmm. And really, not that at Heritage we feel either entitled or defensive about Project 2025. We just are resolute because it's now policy-making season. This is something that we've done for 44 years, since 1980 with Ronald Reagan. We understand that, of course, President-elect Trump and Vice President-elect Vance will make all the decisions. Having said that, Project 2025 is the single greatest, biggest scope of personnel and policy work that's ever happened, and we're very proud of it. It represents several dozen million Americans, if you think about the 110 organizations who are part of it. Once again, totally up to the president-elect and vice president-elect. We operate in service to them and to the American people, but ultimately, to get to the heart of your question, Joe, the American people have won here, and we look forward to playing whatever role, formally or informally, that we can to support that.
Well, did you anticipate the backlash? You mentioned Ronald Reagan. The mandate for leadership was something that was actually pretty well received as a policy paper. It helped to put Heritage on the map. Was this supposed to be another version of that, or sort of a quiet policy paper that you would provide whatever the incoming administration would be?
We wanted to insert substantive policy conversations into the political season. We did not anticipate that the radical left, which couldn't run on its record because it's terrible, would actually use that as the boogeyman and succeed in doing that. Yeah. And look, we made a tactical error in not responding in the first 6 weeks to their total mischaracterizations. That's on us, but ultimately the mischaracterizations are on the radical left. That's a tactical lesson that we've learned, and we'll never repeat that. But that doesn't mean that the substantive part of the work, the policies, the personnel database, which has 20,000 Americans who want to serve, not only in presidential administrations, but also in gubernatorial administrations, is somehow something to be ashamed of. In fact, quite the opposite. We're very proud of it. Having said that, it is very much designed, as all of our previous projects have been designed, which is to be of service. And if I had to predict, the next administration is going to be filled with excellent men and women, not just because of the work we did, but most importantly because of the great acumen of the president-elect and vice president-elect and the team that they're already assembling.
We learned one name just over the weekend. It's Tom Homan, who's going to be the border czar, as Donald Trump is referring to it. And that was from a post on Truth. I don't think that's a position that requires Senate confirmation when it comes to being a czar, whatever that is. But he was one of the authors of 2025. So is the winter over?
It may be. Tom Homan is also a visiting fellow at Heritage. He's a good friend. I was texting him earlier, congratulating him on that. And look, the most important thing, forget Tom's professional affiliation, forget that he was a Project 2025 author. The most important thing is that he is aligned not just with President Trump, but also with the American people who want to bring an end to the ridiculous disorder on the southern border. Tom's going to do a great job there. In other words, Joe, neither today nor a year from today am I going to be sitting in my office at Heritage sort of keeping score about who's in the administration and not. That's not why we do what we do. We exist every day to be of service to the American people and to the administration. For that matter, if the Democrats had won, and although it would have been very surprising for them to have called us and say, you got a name for so-and-so agency, we would have done that too. This is the whole point about the work that Heritage does. Understood.
Although we had heard from the transition team that no one from Project 2025 was invited. We've got home, and that apparently was not the case. Have you talked to Donald Trump since he won?
We've not spoken yet, but I anticipate that we will.
I mean, he's got to be pretty keyed up on what Heritage is offering here. He was on the record when the team was trying to distance itself from you. I have no idea who is behind it. He put on X, I disagree with some of the things they're saying, and some of the things they're saying are absolutely ridiculous and abysmal. Do you have a sense of what he likes or doesn't like here?
I think the key thing is that President Trump saw the branding as a liability in the political season. But I also would anticipate moving forward that the president-elect and vice president-elect, with whom we maintain great relationships, will also understand that it's the policy-making season that Heritage and all of the other groups who are part of our project are built for. And if they're looking, for example, as President Trump said this morning, to dismantle the U.S. Department of Education, we know exactly where he can go for that plan. Totally up to him about whether he uses the plan. But that's what I'm talking about, Joe, when I mentioned that great ideas and great people rise to the top. All of the political calculations of the last few months, which were very understandable and about which we have no hard feelings, are in the past. We're now in the policymaking season. We think that this is the beginning of a golden era of conservative reform. I will say that because the work of Project 2025 represents the conservative movement, it would be very difficult for anybody to implement policies on education, on the border, on taxation, without at least consulting those ideas and people. That's not some arrogant or hubristic comment on our part. That's just the nature of how policymaking works.
Well, so you're back, and you're back with a new book, Dawn's Early Light. It was originally supposed to release in September. Was it your decision to postpone the release? What went into that?
100% my decision, and that was because as president of the Heritage Foundation and Heritage Action for America, I'm a busy guy, like a lot of people are. You can relate to that yourself. And at Heritage Action for America, which is our 501c4 more political arm, we were busy registering almost 100,000 voters in Arizona and Georgia, doing the appropriate ballot chasing to get them to the polls, and succeeded in doing that. And we just thought it would be better in terms of using my time for me to be zealously focused on getting conservative policymakers in a position to have a good conversation and delay the release of the book until this month.
So you didn't think it would jeopardize Donald Trump's chances of being elected or other Republicans based on what you were hearing about 2025?
No, and I understand the question, which is very fair, but not at all. In fact, if you get around to reading the book, you will see the book is a reflection of Trumpism. I mean, this is really where the conservative movement in America are going. And I think because the book is far more oriented around ideas and where we take the movement, the time for that conversation is after the election.
Well, I'll tell you, it's really interesting because I wish I had more time with the book, but I did spend the weekend with it. And you write, for America to flourish again, the institutions you talk about don't need to be reformed. They need to be burned. And you have a list of them. Burn them to the ground. Every Ivy League college, the FBI, the New York Times, the National Institute of Allergy and Infectious Diseases, the Department of Education, which you mentioned, 80% of Catholic higher education, BlackRock, the Loudoun County Public School System, the Boy Scouts of America, Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation, the World Economic Forum, the Chinese Communist Party, and the National Endowment for Democracy. Do you see all of these as being on the same side of something? Is this the uniparty you talk about?
They
Why
are.
burn them?
And what's important context for the list that you have there is the metaphor that I use of a controlled burn. So obviously we're talking about metaphorically regenerating these institutions. But what all of those institutions have in common is that they have forgotten the importance of the everyday American and how so much of the work that they do is oriented around concentrating power in either Washington or New York. There are good people in some of those institutions and in Washington and New York, but what the American people told us last week is that it's time for power to be devolved from those elite institutions back to the states and back to the American people. My book places an emphasis on revitalizing federalism because that gives the people closest to power the opportunity to actually have a say in their government. By the way, I think that's what we're going to see in the next few years.
BlackRock, Larry Fink supports Trump, right?
BlackRock and Larry Fink may have supported President Trump, but before that decision, which I would just speculate is largely political, underwrote a dramatic reorientation of capital from being focused on making profit, which I know you and me and your audience care about, to a socialized idea of ESG. And I'm really glad that one of the great things that has happened in terms of policy, in fact, one of the things we talk about in Project 2025 and at Heritage, is undermining the ridiculous work of Larry Fink and BlackRock.
So it's ESG, not China investment, that turned you. It's both when it comes to BlackRock.
And they're very much related, as you no doubt know.
Well, no, I don't actually.
Well, in fact, let's just take the E in ESG and the environmental emphasis. That actually favors the Chinese Communist Party.
I see where you're going. Understood. So here's the thing that strikes me after spending some time with your book. You and I are from really different places. You grew up in Lafayette, Louisiana, which is a great town, by the way, and I've been there more than once, I want you to know. I'm from a place called Putnam, Connecticut. May as well be from two different planets. My town, I think, was smaller than yours, though. And while you grew up and saw the big oil bust and what happened to families and to households in Lafayette, for me, it was the textile mills, right? We had all of those in these mill towns in Connecticut. They all closed when I was a kid, when the 1980s got there. Then the shopping malls opened, and all the Main Street stores closed. Unemployment went through the roof. Morale went down. Very similar cultural impact, even though we're talking about massively different industries, different geography, different values, I suppose, between a New England family and Louisiana, but actually maybe more similar than you think. You have French-Canadian ancestors. I do too. So we have the same scenario here, and there are different potential solutions, right? Joe Biden's been talking about reshoring and friendshoring and trying to bring jobs back that way. We had the CHIPS Act. What does Project 2025 do? What will Donald Trump do to restore the local economies in communities like the ones you and I are from?
I can't tell you how much, Joe, I appreciate your question. In fact, there's no doubt we have a lot more similarities than differences, right?
We all do, actually, but we don't talk about it like that.
And that's the point of the book, too. But thank you for that framing. But to the heart of your question, which I love, actually, President Biden has talked about that. I think he probably could have done more in his 3.5 years. I don't say that to be a jerk. I say that I think he could have done more, but I give him credit for saying the right things. I think the CHIPS Act is well-intentioned, but there are some details we've got to get right going down the road. But ultimately, where the policy emphasis needs to be is, A, looking at the trade-offs when you have a globalized economy. It isn't that globalization is bad, obviously. It's that there are effects that are deleterious on local communities. But the second is, whether it's friendshoring, onshoring, or providing incentives for American companies to be producing here at home for American jobs, that's the conversation we need to have. And thirdly, because of how evil the Chinese Communist Party regime is, at Heritage, we are fully supportive of tariffs on China. We are not supportive of tariffs across the board, but we do understand that is a valid conversation for us to be having, as opposed to what the political right in this country 10 or 20 years ago would have said, which is you can't even talk about it. We believe we need to look at the data, we need to look at the tax regime as a whole, and we always need to understand that a good, healthy economy flows first from a good, healthy civil society, whether it's Putnam, Connecticut, or Lafayette, Louisiana.
And that's something. Lastly, I want to ask you about personal liberties. I don't want to do the abortion debate here on the air. We've been doing that for months, and I know where you stand on this. You talk about it at length. You highlighted trans as an issue in this campaign. The Republican Party did and got a lot of result from some advertising in that area. Are you focused on minors, on parents, on schools, or are you focused on an adult who says, hey, I have a different view of the world and myself than you do when it comes to things like gender dysmorphia? Should an adult be allowed to do what they want to do with their own body?
From a policymaking standpoint, especially over the next few years, we're focused on minors. Mm-hmm. But the reason that we at Heritage are so concerned about transgender ideology is because it harms any human person it touches. We love every human person. We believe in the dignity of every human person. And it's on those grounds that we think even for adults, this is problematic.
Problematic because they're talking to kids about it, or they're going to somehow infect other adults? What's your worry?
Both. Hopefully there's real agreement in this country. Actually, I know there's real agreement in this country, evidenced by how effective a political issue this was last week, that we have a real issue with how much the transgender ideology has been imposed on children through our schools, through our institutions, going back to your earlier question.
As opposed to just someone going about their business as, a 30-year-old, this is a choice I made.
That's a big difference.
That's a big difference. I'm glad that we could spend some time together, and I hope this is the start of a conversation that we'd like to continue here on Bloomberg.
I'll come back anytime.
I would love that, by the way. Dawn's Early Light is the book. Kevin Roberts, happy to meet you. Good luck with your travels. You almost missed a train for us. We'll have a lot more ahead on the fastest show in politics right here on Bloomberg.
You're listening to the Bloomberg Balance of Power podcast. Catch us live weekdays at noon Eastern on Apple CarPlay and Android Auto with the Bloomberg Business app. You can also listen live on Amazon Alexa from our flagship New York station. Just say, Alexa, play Bloomberg 1130.
I think we need to set the baseline not only on the markets, but on the vote. We spent all last week, of course, with you from New York, counting the votes, post-Tuesday, and we're still counting in the House. The House has not been called. We've got 19 outstanding races. Republicans only need to win 5 of them to maintain control of the chamber. We had a couple more calls over the weekend, and the Senate, firmly Republican. Now that they've added Nevada to the list, we're waiting on Arizona, where the Democrat is in the lead, Ruben Gallego, knowing, of course, now that Donald Trump won the state, making a complete sweep, the full sweep of all 7 battleground states that we spent the weekend talking about. Jackie Rosen, the Democrat, if I didn't make that clear, projected to win Nevada's Senate race here. Fascinating conversation with Kevin Roberts, and that is one that you are only going to hear on this program. Where else on TV or radio will you hear a deep dive like that with someone so important to the process and the conversation in this campaign? Of course, the head of the Heritage Foundation and the force behind Project 2025. If it's the end of crypto winter, which it surely is with Bitcoin at a new all-time high here, apparently it's the end of Project 2025 winter. Because one of the authors of this 900-page plus document that had tongues wagging all summer has been hired by the transition team. Tom Homan will be the border czar for Trump 2.0. Coming back into the fold, he was already part of the Trump administration last time around and is coming back here. Senior immigration official in 1.0. Donald Trump is actually using the term border czar, emulating what Joe Biden was doing with Kamala Harris. Let's reassemble our panel. Jeanne Zaino is with us, Democratic analyst and Bloomberg politics contributor, political science professor at Iona University. Joined today by Lester Munson, Republican strategist, BGR Group. Great to see both of you here and welcome. Lester, I don't know your thoughts. I know you listened to our conversation, but I haven't had a chance to talk to you in the break here. Kevin Roberts is now out of the cold, will be helping to influence the transition. How do you see it?
Well, I think that's not totally unexpected at all. The purpose of Heritage and these other think tanks in town is to offer policy suggestions to policymakers, whether they're in the executive branch or the legislative branch. Very natural that after the campaign is over, that these ideas they surfaced in their 2025 report would be considered by the incoming Trump administration, and certainly some of the personnel recommendations I think are already starting to work out in that report's favor, and there will be some other victories for them as well. There'll be some other things that aren't victories. The thing that struck me, Joe, first of all, excellent interview, and I did learn a lot, and I loved your comparison of the hometowns. The interesting thing for me is that this is a think tank that makes policy suggestions, but also has some rather inflammatory language about burning down institutions. That, for me, is kind of the strange value add here from Heritage Foundation. I'm not sure how helpful that is at the end of the day. We're certainly getting plenty of fiery metaphors and adjectives from the candidates. I don't know that we need them from think tanks also.
I get you there. And he did. I was actually going to ask him that, but he did make clear that he was using figurative language and, referring to burning down institutions. But fighting fire with fire is a big theme in his book, Jeanne. He talks about rekindling the fire of the American tradition, burning away the rot, a long controlled burn of targets like the FBI, which, again, he said was not literal. The book's original subtitle, in fact, was Burning Down Washington to Save America. But as the Democrat on our panel, Jeanne, after listening to him talk for the better part of 20 minutes about a lot of different issues, in what was not a confrontational conversation, I wonder if it makes you feel more comfortable about any of the contents here.
Yeah, I agree with Lester. It was an excellent conversation and it was collegial and I learned a lot. I have not read his new book, but I have read and written about Project 2025. And what struck me as you asked that last question is the fact that one of the pillars of Project 2025, which Kevin Roberts talks about, is that we are going to secure our individual liberty. And that was in the context you asked that question about transgender issues. Mm-hmm. And I think it is quite, the example to think about since it played such a role in the election. And of course, what he came back and said was anything but about the protection of liberty. What he said when you asked him to differentiate between children and adults was he's talking about everybody, that he is concerned indeed that adults who choose to live their life in this way may infect children, infect other adults. This is why, as we look back, you have places like Politico and others refer to this as a Christian nationalist authoritarian movement, because while it wraps itself in a conservative dogma, the reality is when they talk about liberty, they talk about God-given liberty. That is the liberty to live as he believes God wants us to, not as we in the United States do. And that's why they talk about ending separation of church and state. And of course, I agree with Lester. Take away the fiery language. They are talking about eliminating the FBI, eliminating the Department of Commerce, eliminating the Department of Education. No question, all of these can be curbed, and there's a lot of bloat in DC that can be cut, no question. But this is a dramatic document, and there is a reason Donald Trump moved away from it in the campaign, because he knew it would be unpopular with the American public. And lo and behold, a few days later, what did he do? He nominates to run our immigration and the border one of the contributors. Yeah. It is worth everybody reading Project 2025, even if 25% of it gets into policy. It is a dramatic shift in what has been U.S. history and U.S. policy.
Yeah, take it from me. It's a long read. Lester, I'm struck by the similarity in the language that we're hearing between some conservatives and progressives following the election. The aforementioned Kevin Roberts, in his foreword for Project 2025, talks about under our Constitution, the elites here, and under our Constitution, the equality that is provided. He writes, nearly every top-tier U.S. university president or Wall Street hedge fund manager has more in common with a socialist, a European head of state, than with the parents at a high school football game in Waco, Texas. Get these lines. Many elites, he says, entire identity, it seems, is wrapped up in their sense of superiority over those people. But under our Constitution, he writes, they are the mere equals of the workers who shower after work instead of before. Right? That's Kevin Roberts' Heritage Foundation. Pramila Jayapal, who is the head of the Progressive Caucus in the House. We have become a party of elites, she writes, choosing the same word. Whether we abandon working class people, whether they abandon us, whether it's some combination of all of the above. Do we need to get Kevin Roberts and Pramila Jayapal into a room to solve this?
Yeah, Joe, it's fascinating that the civil wars inside each party seem more compelling to the fighters than the actual conflict between the parties themselves. And I think
Yes.
part of this is because of the changing nature of the way we vote, right? It's not about persuading the middle anymore or the undecideds or the independents. It's about getting the low propensity voters on your side to actually show up and vote. That's the mechanism that matters. That's the revolution that Trump actually brought to the Republican Party. Was less about the yelling and screaming and more about he just got people to show up who would otherwise not vote. The Democrats lost 10 million votes from 2020 to 2024. For whatever reason, Joe Biden was able to get those 10 million people to show up and Kamala Harris wasn't. And I have a feeling what Democrats are going to spend a lot of time trying to figure out is how do we get those 10 million people back to the voting booth showing up to vote for our candidate? That way we can win. So this like civil war inside the two parties is about trading off a few elite votes for a lot of votes, maybe more at the bottom of the economic spectrum. That might be a little bit healthy, but it is kind of fascinating that both parties are doing pretty much the exact same thing.
Isn't that right? What a great conversation with our panel. Can't do this anywhere else. Jeanne, Zaino, thank you. Of course, Bloomberg Politics contributor, Lester Munson, BGR Group. There's a lot to think about, and we have a lot of questions to answer as we make our way to the next administration.
You're listening to the Bloomberg Balance of Power podcast. Catch us live weekdays at noon Eastern on Apple CarPlay and Android Auto with the Bloomberg Business app. Listen on demand wherever you get your podcasts or watch us live on YouTube.
We're back on Bloomberg TV and radio from the nation's capital. Back from world headquarters in New York following many days of counting votes, and we're not done yet. The House has still not been called. This week after, we've got nearly 20 outstanding House races, a lot of them in California, where the balance of power will be decided, and it's looking like it will be decided in favor of Republicans. Of the 19 races still not called, Republicans only need to win 5. Democrats need to win 15. That's where we are in sports. Brad Howard, an expert on all things House, joins us right now from his perch at Corcoran Street. Brad was a chief of staff in the House, Stephanie Murphy, as a matter of fact, who you see quite often on this program, the Democrat from Florida. A blue dog Democrat, had floor privileges, and knows exactly what this moment is when we're trying to find out who's in charge, who's going to run the committees. Will there be a power sharing agreement? All of this stuff is still possible, by the way, because if you were listening closely to what I said, Democrats actually could still win the House. We could still have divided government. It's just a less likely scenario with the paths that we're seeing right now. But following our conversation with Kevin Roberts, I wonder what Brad Howard has to think about our conversation about the working class, about why things went the way they did last week. And glad to see you right now, Brad. It's my first chance to compare notes since the election, and I hope that you're doing well. Before I get into the big picture stuff, just give me your read on the House. Are you giving this to Republicans, or you're waiting for every vote to be counted?
Well, we should wait till we at least have a call on the remaining races, at least enough to determine if there's 218. But it does remind me of that scene in Dumb and Dumber where he's like, "You've got a 1 in a million chance." He's saying, "So there's still a chance." So I'm still hoping. So, I do think the Republicans had a great night. I think the Democrats have got to figure out what the problem with our brand is. And I've heard too many of my own party try to say, well, America is racist, or it's, misogynistic, or, they didn't know how they were voting, or they're tricked by conservative media. And if your premise of this is entering the conversation with assuming voters were somehow tricked or duped, then you're never going to learn the lesson. The Democratic brand was resoundingly rejected in nearly all demographics. And we have to figure out why. And the conversation's got to start with not with blaming voters, but with understanding voters. And, as a party, it's our responsibility to go to the voters, not to sit here and expect voters to come to us. And until we figure that out, we're going to continue to lose. And so I hope that we look to the Blue Dogs for a lot of the answers. If you look back, some of the closest races in the country, Jared Golden of Maine and Marie Gluesenkamp Perez of Washington State, were Blue Dog co-chairs, and they won. They outperformed the Democratic ticket wildly. We're still waiting on Mary Peltola in Alaska and a few of the Blue Dog endorsed candidates in California. But so far the Blue Dog incumbents have held up very well.
Well, interesting. So with your Blue Dog hat on, I want to spin back to the conversation we had earlier this hour with Kevin Roberts of the Heritage Foundation. He's out with a new book, Brad, you might have heard about. He's, of course, the driving force behind Project 2025. And he writes in his foreword for the project that many elites, use the term elites, entire identity, it seems, is wrapped up in their sense of superiority over the working class and what he refers to here as parents at a high school football game in Waco, Texas. Under our Constitution, though, he says they are mere equals of the workers who shower after work instead of before. It's actually pretty good writing. And it sounds a heck of a lot like Pramila Jayapal, who says we've become a party of elites and talks about the working class abandoning the Democratic Party, or is it the other way around? What does it tell us when the two ends of the political spectrum come around and meet in this way in the narrative?
Well, there's no doubt that there's a populism streak running through the American people at the moment. And I think Democrats have a couple structural problems that are plaguing our party at the moment. I think we've got to stop letting kind of young, college-educated, white, urban liberals dictate to the rest of the party, particularly in the socialist shoes. There's rapid change right now in the American society, from automation to technological to social civil rights movement. There's a lot coming at people, we've got to understand why some of them can't move as fast as we would like, and we have to have patience, and we have to come with them. I think the second thing is you have a big disconnect in the organized labor movement. You have the national chapters, which are adamantly Democratic and work with Democratic Party. And you have the rank and file, which, as we've seen in this election, and the working class swung wildly to Trump. So if Democratic Party leaders are listening to the national labor chapters, there's a big disconnect there. And if we're listening to them but getting none of their votes, then something's off kilter. And so we've got to ask the questions about why that disconnect is there and start listening to the rank and file union members that are out there in the country. And they're telling us what they want. Right? They're telling us they resent the fact that if you have a college degree, it means you can't be successful. They resent the fact that the rich are getting richer and the hardworking Americans are getting ahead. I think Democrats ignored the alarm bells around inflation too late. And when we finally did, the American people said, well, if you can't even acknowledge that there's a problem, why would I like you to fix it? And keep in mind, Donald Trump won with one very simple premise. It's been the same premise he's had since 2016. Things are broke, and I'm going to fix it. And the Democrats didn't have much to come back with. We didn't have a consistent message. And the closing visuals of the campaign were Trump wearing an orange worker's vest, driving a garbage truck in a McDonald's. Kamala was with Beyonce and in the Ellipse in Washington, D.C. So I think we need to look at our messaging. We need to look at who we're listening to and who we're talking to. And we've got to have some tough conversations. I think everybody's right and everybody's wrong. So there's a lot to look at.
Great analysis. You used the word resent, Brad. Bernie Sanders used the word angry in his interview on Meet the Press yesterday. Let's listen.
The working people of this country are extremely angry. They have a right to be angry. In the richest country in the history of the world, today the people on top are doing phenomenally well, while 60% of Americans are living paycheck to paycheck. Where is the Democratic Party? Are they prepared to stand up to these powerful corporate interests, raise the minimum wage, fight for health care for all people, make sure that all of our kids get the quality education that they need, expand Social Security?
Of course, he's an independent, not a Democrat. But Brad, how come it's so easy for everyone to have this conversation today instead of last Monday morning?
Well, I think, number one, I want to point out that Kamala Harris got a higher percent of the vote in her race in Vermont than Bernie Sanders did in his. So first. And number two is that Bernie's already trying to prescribe solutions. And this is part of the problem with the Democratic Party. The solutions we're prescribing, like, Americans generally support, but they don't like us. You saw in states where they voted to codify abortion rights, but yet voted for Donald Trump. They voted to codify paid family leave, but voted for Donald Trump. So what's it tell you when they generally like our solutions and our policy positions, but they don't like us? That is a branding and connection problem. Like, you cannot show up in the Black and Hispanic communities 2 months before an election and expect them to listen. It looks the way it is. It looks like you're pandering. And so we've got to build inroads in these communities. We've got to get off these college campuses and into We got to get out of the boardrooms and into the break rooms. We've got to really have conversations with these workers. And I think number two is the resentment is, so when you look at, for instance, the Biden college student loan debt relief, the people that have worked hard their whole life, who passed on the fancy vacations, who passed on the fancy cars and fancy houses and scrimped and saved to put their kids through college, and then yet they see their neighbors who lived irresponsibly all of a sudden get a check from the government, their loan forgiven. That builds resentment. I'm not saying it's bad policy. I'm just saying it builds resentment. And so we've got to understand that there's a populist streak in the government, in the electorate right now, that's looking at an unfair system. And when you think the system is unfair and it's broken, you're going to go to the guy that's telling you he's going to fix it. You're not going to go to the party that's that's refusing to acknowledge anything's broken. And when we said defending democracy, I think a lot of voters took that as defending the status quo, of defending the broken system. And I think that backfired on us.
Wow. I hope everyone understands here that people are going to be hiring Brad Howard for the next 2 years to explain this to them in a room. And you're getting it right now on this Monday here on Bloomberg. Brad, you're a creature of the House. Bring us inside what's about to happen here, because Hakeem Jeffries is going to either have a razor-thin majority or he's going to lead the party of the insurgency. Which one is actually more impactful? Which one's easier?
Well, I mean, obviously being the minority is always easier. The response of governing is hard, and Republicans have figured that out this last 2 years. What I will say, what this does, we know it's going to be close margin regardless of who wins, right? That's for sure. What that does is that actually empowers groups like the Blue Dogs on the Hill and the moderate Republicans, the Republican governance groups, so to speak, because we've seen that the far right, the kind of what we call the right-wing MAGA crowd, doesn't want to govern. And so, Speaker Johnson has struggled over the last year and a half to put together a group of Republicans that can pass a rule to put things on the floor as simple as funding the government. And he's had to rely on Leader Jeffries to deliver Democratic votes so they can govern. I suspect that's going to continue. And so really the kingmakers here, regardless if the Democrats have the majority or if the Republicans have the majority, it's going to be groups like the Blue Dog Democrats, of which I know well, and the New Dems, of which I know well, and the Problem Solvers Caucus. Like these moderate coalitions, you talk about a power sharing agreement, there won't really be a formal one. There's always an informal power sharing agreement that determines committee sizes and stuff, but there may actually be forced into an informal power sharing agreement, because if the far right is never going to vote to allow Speaker Johnson to bring responsible legislation to the floor, he's going to have to rely on Leader Jeffries. And Leader Jeffries has shown that he will put the governing and the American people over partisan politics. And I'll add too, Leader Jeffries, you got to remember, didn't force all the Democrats to vote a certain way in the last 2 years. He's allowed them to vote as they need to vote. So when they come together, he's in a strong position to help this Democratic Party heal. And because he allowed people to vote the way they need to vote. So he's going to be a great leader and resource to turn to as this party emerges and figures out where to go forward.
Well, that's why I asked what might have sounded like a weird question, because Speaker Johnson, if this is in fact going to be a thin Republican majority, will need Hakeem Jeffries. He will need Democrats to get things done, which makes him enormously influential in the minority, doesn't it?
Yeah, and keep in mind, like when I was chief of staff to Congresswoman Stephanie Murphy, she was leader of the Blue Dogs. When we came in, Republicans had full control of government. They had the House, the Senate, and the White House. This was in 2017. So, I have a lot of experience personally navigating to being a Democrat, in a year. But to your point about why now people are having these conversations and we haven't really had before, you got to keep in mind when Trump won in 2016, it shocked everyone. And a lot of people chalked that up to, well, Hillary won the popular vote. Well, Russia intervened. Well, it was the James Comey letter, right? And so we never had the discussion, the hard lessons, because we thought we won. And then you go to 2020 and they did win. And I think we took the wrong lesson from both of those. And so this is the first time in 2 presidential cycles that we've had a tough conversation internally as a party. And I think what caught a lot of people off guard, I think all the polls show that Trump was a slight favorite to win, and he did. But I don't think everyone suspected the incredible growth and support he had across nearly every single demographic, and a clean sweep of the battleground states. And even you look at areas like Cook County, Illinois, where Chicago is, he had a 12 to 15 point swing, double-digit swing in his favor, which is just, you got to really think, if we're losing the heartland and we're losing votes in urban areas, what is left?
Absolutely incredible, and such great analysis by Brad Howard. I can't thank you enough, Brad, for the deep dive today. He's at Corcoran Street Group, where he is the founder and president, as mentioned, former chief of staff, Congresswoman Stephanie Murphy. Great to see you, Brad.
You're listening to the Bloomberg Balance of Power podcast. Catch us live weekdays at noon Eastern on Apple CarPlay and Android Auto with the Bloomberg Business app. You can also listen live on Amazon Alexa from our flagship New York station. Just say, Alexa, play Bloomberg 1130.
Here on Balance of Power, on Bloomberg Radio, on the satellite, and on YouTube, where you can find us right now. Search Bloomberg Business News Live. We've got the cameras set up for you here and a lot to talk about as we wait for California. Throw another log on the fire. They still have almost 5 million ballots, 5 million votes to count in California, which means it could be another week, another two. I don't know. We'll find out here. 950,000 in Los Angeles County alone. And they get 30 days to count in California as we wait to see who's going to control the House. This is why things are taking so long. In a world in which we can all vote on American Idol and solve this with millions of people weighing in a matter of seconds, we'll wait weeks for the state of California to choose its representatives here in Washington, D.C. A little different in the Senate. We've just got one left. That's Arizona, which Donald Trump won over the weekend. It looks like we've got some ticket splitting there with Ruben Gallego, the Democrat, leading Kari Lake. Big questions as well about the transition. And when we talk about what's happening on Capitol Hill versus what's happening at the White House versus what's happening on the campaign trail, there are very few people you can call to hit all three. Ron Bonjean is one of them. As Politico writes, he is one of the most popular communicators in Washington, and that is quite an achievement in a town with this much hot air. Chief spokesman for the Speaker of the House, for the Senate Majority Leader. He also helped in the transition last time around. And he knows a thing or two about what we're discussing, having also worked in the executive branch. Ron Bonjean is also founder partner at a firm you hear a lot about on this broadcast, ROKK Solutions, one of the pillars of K Street. Ron, we finally got you in. It's great to see you. Welcome to Bloomberg's Balance of Power. What a treat.
Thank you so much. It's an honor to be here. And thank you for that.
Well, my God.
Introduction.
I hope I came close because I've got some questions for you, and I'm really wondering how you're feeling about a lot of things. I'm going to start with something rather esoteric, and that is the leadership battle that's taking place here and about to unfold in the Senate. It looks like now that Donald Trump has won, the deck may be shuffled here. We were talking about John Thune versus John Cornyn. There was Rick Scott over on the side, but nobody saw that as a real possibility. Now MAGA is endorsing him, not Trump, but Tucker Carlson and many others. As we heard from Rick Scott, the senator from Florida, on Sunday morning television. Let's listen.
We have got to change the way the Senate is run to get Trump's agenda done. What it's going to take is somebody who's going to take the time to sit down and bring people together. We've got to get, for a lot of things, 60 votes in the Senate. So we've got to have somebody that's going to sit down with Democrats and say, how do we balance a budget? How do we do these things?
Okay.
That's all I've done. I'm a deal guy.
It's a secret ballot, though, Ron Bonjean. Can MAGA change the order here in the leadership in the Senate, or is this just a diversion for you and I to talk about today?
Yeah, it's really tough when it's a secret ballot. You know, if it was a transparent ballot and senators had to put their names on it, their Republican MAGA constituents would be lighting them up. I find it highly unlikely that Senator Rick Scott actually affects this vote tremendously with this outside campaign to persuade the inside. This is an insider's game. And while Donald Trump is president-elect, you know, in ways has a tremendous amount of power going in and is already making big moves. You know, senators like this is a very club-like atmosphere. It's very difficult to make the changes that Rick Scott would like to see. And imagine if Rick Scott forced his way in the way he's doing it right now. How would he be able to manage that conference, you know, going forward? He's going to need them. So, you know, the pressure on the outside can backfire on him. And if it were to work, there would be a lot of, I would say, you know, sour taste in Republicans' mouths.
Yeah. Does Trump care himself, or does he figure whoever wins here, he can affect, whether it's Thune, Cornyn, or Scott?
Listen, if Trump knew who the winner was going to be out of this, he would probably back that person because you don't, going in being the most, president-elect, you're not going to want to back a loser. That's a bad message you're sending in right away that you made a strategic mistake. So he's being very careful. And I don't think that anybody telling him to stay out, I thought what Senator Thune said about him staying out of the race, I thought, okay, well, you asking him to stay out of the race means that he's likely going to weigh in at some point then, if you're asking him to stay out. But we'll see what happens.
Yeah. All right, give me your read on the House. Does it go Republican? The math is certainly pointing that way. And if that happens, does Mike Johnson remain Speaker?
Yeah, it's likely going to remain in Republican hands. All eyes, are out west. And we're talking about, plus 1, 2, 3, 4 votes, something along those lines, a very handful of votes that would be, and it's better to be the majority than the minority because you're setting the agenda, you're setting the committee schedules, everything hinges on that. However, this is going to be very difficult for Johnson because what if a member of Congress gets sick, a Republican gets sick? What if there's a car that's broken down the highway? He needs every vote on the big ones to make it count. And, I think for the next decade, we're going to have back and forth, small margin Democrats, small margin Republicans. So this is an area that Johnson has operated decently well in. He's thrown into the mix during the midterm, like mid-year, and he's doing well. And I think he knows how to handle it with Trump on his side, by the way, which might help affect how the Freedom Caucus operates and relates to him.
So then to the transition. We're touching all three bases with Ron Bonjean. We got a couple of names here. I'm sure you're hearing a lot more than those are being published. Elise Stefanik to the UN. Tom Homan is going to be border czar. And we understand that Stephen Miller is going to get a deputy chief of staff role when it comes to policy in this case. You've actually helped to orchestrate transitions like these. Ron Bonjean, when will it be complete? And when you go downstairs out to dinner or for a drink on K Street, you go into the prime rib next door. What's the number one conversation? Is it tariffs or taxes or what?
Yeah, no, look, I worked on the first Trump transition. We were in charge of making sure those nominees got across the line, got confirmed. And, right now, Trump is very clearly making moves early. He is not sitting still going forward. A lot of other president-elects carefully plan and time out their announcements. That's not the way Trump does it. He rolls them out there. I mean, the transition really hasn't officially begun. I mean, they have not moved into, they're still negotiating about moving into the large GSA building that's used by thousands of Trump team members to prepare nominees for confirmation. But I'd say that the number one thing that K Street is looking at is who's going to be in power under the Trump in the Trump cabinet. So right now, I was just hearing at State. Could it be Senator Haggerty or could it be Senator Rubio? That was the latest I just heard before coming in here. Who's making it? Who's not making it? I mean, look at Senator Pompeo left by the wayside. Not former Secretary of State Pompeo left by the wayside. So, underneath that, sure, there are a lot of policies that organizations now have to get ready for, but you have to see the details of those policies and you need to know who's in charge.
That's right.
We're still, a little ways away from January 20th. But I'll tell you, Donald Trump is making moves. I think he's going to make the most moves that any president-elect has ever done affecting policy and affecting change before he's even entered office. I mean, look, he already talked to Putin with Musk on the phone, and he also told him, don't mess with Ukraine. I have weapons and I'll use them. He's not even sure. He's not even sworn in yet.
Yeah, I don't know how appropriate a lot of people feel that is, but that's where we are. And apparently they did get on the phone together. Ron Bonjean, what's it going to be like? And there's some shades of 1980 here. Do you think that the Middle East unfolds, Ukraine unfolds around the time of the inaugural, whatever the next chapters are in those two theaters?
Well, in terms of foreign policy, I think that world
Yeah.
leaders view Donald Trump as an unpredictable an unpredictable person. They're going to really tread with caution with him. I mean, they did so during his first administration very carefully. They're going to do it again. And so Trump is going to lay out his red lines out there, like he just did with Putin. It's unimaginable to see what it will be like going in at this point, because I think every day feels like a giant news cycle. But clearly there will be hesitation among China, Russia, Iran on making big moves on Donald Trump's watch.
Fascinating stuff here. As someone who helped to orchestrate the last transition, I'm just curious, lastly, what you expect to hear. There's been a lot of attention paid to Project 2025 and that second pillar that includes personnel. There's also been reporting that because there's no contract or agreement with the GSA, the transition team is doing its own vetting using a private security firm instead of the FBI. What does all that result in?
Yeah, look, I would say that, Donald Trump doesn't adhere to norms and the standards that are set out there. It's very clear. We've seen it, all for years. So it's likely going to, this transition, I think they need that infrastructure that will be helpful. Being there on site, I mean, we had a mock hearing room. We knew where every transition team was around the nominees in one building so we could get to them quickly and have conversations that needed to take place. Can it occur outside of that? Yes. I would say the number one target that on Donald Trump's mind right now is the Pentagon. I think that there are generals that he doesn't like in there who that he wants to get out and install his own people in. Get rid of some of the bureaucracy that he finds would be challenging to his ideas. I don't know what those are, but I have heard from those connected to the Trump world that that's a big goal of his.
Ron Bonjean, I hope this won't be so long before we get you back. It's great to see you, and thank you so much for the insights with his experience from the transition, from the Capitol, and from the White House. Co-founder, partner, ROKK Solutions, Ron Bonjean, with us on the fastest show in politics. Thanks for listening to the Balance of Power podcast. Make sure to subscribe if you haven't already at Apple, Spotify, or wherever you get your podcasts. And you can find us live every weekday from Washington, D.C. at noontime Eastern at Bloomberg.com.